showtime!
In my C2 video, I said I wasn't going to consider C1s because I was more interested in the power of C2s by themselves. But as we get higher in the constellations, some of them will start to require earlier ones to function fully or properly. In that case, they will be considered, but I still don't consider Tao C4 good because it means you have C1, or something like Raiden C4 really good because you have her C2 and C3. That's cumulative power, and I'm more concerned about individual strength here. Which brings me to asking the question of how many C4s are actually... Wait, that doesn't seem right for C4s. Let me start that over. How many C4s don't suck as much as the $900 it costs to get them or the two bull cons that surround them? There we go. Now that's more accurate. I think we can all agree that Venti's constellations, they sadly leave a lot to be desired. They're not the best, and maybe they suffer from just early design. A 25% anima bonus is fine, however, having to pick up a particle to do that, you know, it's not hard to do, but it is still a requirement that needs to be fulfilled, and the reward isn't even that good, leaving this to just be a very mediocre con, even if you do decide to play him at raw damage. Klee's is the first one where we will actually discuss a previous constellation, that being the C2, opening her up as more of a support option. If you go down the route of actually using her as a support with her C2 and her C4, this actually gives her burst a purpose, making it a giant pyro nuke. And as we all know, vaped and melted bursts, they can do a ton of damage. And quite frankly, this turns Klee's burst into the giant nuke I think it always should have been. It makes so much more sense with her design to just have a giant explosion. And you know what? I think this one is really well designed, it's strong, it suits both playstyles. I think it's a very good constellation. In the right conditions, Xiao C4 is going to add DPS to your team, but that is going to be very dependent on your comp and how well you're playing it. There's also scenarios where it's actually going to hurt your team if you don't know how to properly play around it, or if your team actually can't. It's a con that can be beneficial in something like a freeze team, and it's also a con that can hurt you if your play isn't absolutely perfect. I just think that the risk is greater than the reward for this constellation, and overall that makes it not a very good one. On one hand, the max petrification time for Zhongli is going to go up to 6 seconds, which is an increase of 50%. On another hand, if you're playing Zhongli, you have his shield, and it's so tanky that it doesn't matter if things are hitting you because you're practically invincible anyway. Now that doesn't mean that it doesn't have any value, I just don't value it much as a survival option because it's on Zhongli. The petrification's value comes in keeping enemies still, which will allow your damage to be more consistent on them, which in some cases, like in the case of a Geovishap or something like a Sisson Mage that jumps around, it will actually increase your damage by quite a bit. Not to mention, if the increased AoE size ever makes it so something got hit that wouldn't have otherwise, that makes it pretty damn good. I certainly don't think it's anything excessively broken, but I think it's a very strong constellation, and even more importantly, a well-designed one. I have shit on Albedo's Constellation 4 before, and I will do it again. It is so bad. I know a lot of people immediately go, oh, but Xiao, his is like one of his best teams, blah, 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 blah. Xiao has so much percent damage increase already from all the crap he has going on in his kit that this 30% is drastically diminished. Moreover, why should it take a very specific other 5-star to take value of a C4 within his own kit? Sure, anybody can use the elevator, but if you are using that, you are overdosing on copium. And yes, Dragon Strike exists too, but that's just so niche, I don't even want to touch it. It's just a very mediocre con. For clarification for anyone who didn't know, the way that Ganyu's burst reads might, not burst, or C4, might confuse you and might think it makes the enemy take a multiplicative 25% damage boost. Sadly, that is not the case, and this is in the same category as something like cryo percent damage bonus from a goblet. That being said, this is still a very strong constellation, especially in the case of Morgana comp, which has become her most prominent comp, with something like Melt Ganyu being kinda shoved to the side. So with that in mind, in the case of a Morgana team, this is going to just increase team-wide damage by a considerable amount. And with it being a debuff that applies to the enemy, that makes it relatively consistent, especially with her burst uptime, so it's a pretty strong con.
Useless. Boring. Useless. Boring. Useless. Boring.
Okay, if you want my serious opinion on this con, it is irredeemably bad. Don't rely on this crappy con to try to survive, just build a better team for show. Tao C4's value comes entirely out of the supports you put her with. The more damage that they are doing, the better this C4 is. So stuff really strong units like Yelan and Xingqiu in her party like you pretty much should do anyway, and it's a pretty damn good con. It's just really hard to say how much it's going to help your team because that entirely depends on the investment of your own units. Look, I know it's an incredibly obvious thing to say that this would have been better if it was above 50% HP rather than below. Most things would be. But when it comes to Eula, things live in pretty much one or two states, either horrifically mangled by a burst explosion or soon to be horrifically mangled by a burst explosion. Yes, some things might survive and you may actually get a second burst off, and that would be very tanky boss enemies, and yeah, this might get some use. But I do think this constellation is a little bit counterintuitive to the actual design and how the character is played, that being gigantic nukes that pretty much just 100-0 things, leaving this to feel like it's just not rewarding enough to justify the condition that it has. While Kazuha C4 does have some meme fun overworld value with gliding around to get your energy back, at least 75% of it, which apparently you can use before starting an Abyss floor, by the way, because of the staircase, it's not exactly the most impactful constellation from a pure, like, meta standpoint. The C1 already does quite a bit to potentially limit ER requirements, as well as most of his best weapons already kind of assist with this in some way, shape, or form anyway. If they really want to make this broken, they should have made it just increase gliding speed by like 50%. I would have rolled for that shit. But as it is right now, I think this is just a pretty, you know, weak to average constellation. We all know that defense shred is an incredibly strong source of damage, and this constellation just bakes a huge chunk of it into what is already the main purpose for using Ayaka in the first place, which is to use her burst and murder everything. This is an exceptionally strong constellation, and the uptime of the defense shred will actually be pretty respectable, you know, if something actually manages to live a C4 Ayaka burst. Which, let's be real, we all know that's just not very likely. Not to mention that this defense shred is going to benefit the entire party, not just herself. There's a really important factor that a lot of people don't consider when it comes to cooldown reducing constellations like this. Supports matter quite a bit, and even if you can remove the cooldown entirely, you're still going to have to swap off of them to use their abilities and sometimes give them energy. You can build a team around this and try to stay in her skill for as long as possible, but it will be more efficient to just play her properly and her C4 won't actually change much. And yes, I know someone's going to say it's good for co-op. It will reduce the cooldown and allow you to main DPS her more effectively when she is the only character you have to use, but that does not help you in the Abyss. Raiden C4 has one major issue, and that's that it doesn't really do anything for your first rotation. You pop all your bursts, use their supports, snapshot whatever attack percents they have at the time, and then you use Raiden's burst last when she's all buffed up. And if you have C4 Raiden, that means your Raiden might just be strong enough that you might not even make it to his second rotation. If you do make it to that second rotation though, 30% attack is pretty damn good. So there will be times, many times I think, where this does absolutely nothing, and there will be other times where it'll contribute a decent buff for your party. It's just rather unfortunate that it excludes herself, so it'll get the most value in something like Raiden National, where a lot of the damage is coming from the other teammates as well. Kokomi C4 brings a little bit of everything to the table by giving her attack speed that's not only going to buff her healing by getting more attacks in per second, but it's also going to help her damage. Pretty well, all things considered, due to the lack of hit lag on ranged attacks. Not to mention with the C1 requiring the third attack of her hit chain, this will make that proc even more. So with all that being said, if you are using a main field Kokomi, this is going to be pretty decent, but otherwise, it's not going to do anything for you. A painful one for me because I actually have Itto C4 and I did not want it. I was okay with staying C2 forever. Itto's most common team is Quad Geo with Zhongli, Albedo, and Goro. The defense is going to benefit Albedo a little bit. The attack will do nothing. The attack will do a little bit for Zhongli, but the defense will do nothing. And Goro's personal damage is so low that I would actually rather have a literal puppy licking the enemies to death because it would probably be more effective. Much like what I said for Albedo's constellation, is this completely useless and irredeemable? No, it has some value. But is that value worth rolling for a C4 that is incredibly expensive? No, it is merely just a stepping stone for the C6, much like a lot of these underwhelming C4s are. I'm gonna be straight up, I don't even know how to judge this constellation. It seems like one of those ones that you have to own and actually use and see with your own eyes to really be able to judge it properly. On paper, I think it looks okay. However, what you gotta consider is that Shenhe is not really there for her personal damage, nor is she built for it. Normally she's built for support with things like 4-piece Noblesse to give attack percent, or just straight up double attack percent with all attack percent artifacts to maximize the strength of her buff. Based on what's written about it from people who presumably have it, it just doesn't seem to be very impactful. These party buffing ones are what I consider to be the most boring and unexciting of the constellations, especially for C4s. I think there should be something a little bit more interesting here. However, this one is probably one of the better ones, especially considering now with the introduction of Dendro, it is entirely possible to stuff 3 Electro units into a party and have it actually make sense, meaning you can get a lot of value out of this one. Not to mention 100% uptime with a very easy requirement. I think this is just a pretty damn decent con. Just, you know, not broken. Attack speed is a very precious stat that is rarely given out and highly coveted by a character like Ayato himself, so being able to give himself and his whole party 15% attack speed, that's pretty damn good. It ends up being an almost 1-for-1% increase to his damage, but it also bolsters his strength as a support, and given that his main support value comes from using his burst, this is just icing on the cake. So being able to benefit not only himself, but potentially others makes us a very strong constellation. What I have to say about Yelan C4 is incredibly simple. It is the closest thing to a Bennett burst we have, but for HP users, and now that Hydra Resonance also gives HP percent, makes this even more valuable. It gives almost as much as an HP percent artifact does, but for the entire party, and with an incredibly easy activation that has an incredibly generous duration, which can also be stacked up very quickly thanks to the extra charge of her skill from her C1. When put in teams with other HP users like Hu Tao and Zhongli, who are conveniently all in a top meta team together, it is an incredibly powerful constellation, not just for herself, but for her entire team. Combine this with the fact that we're getting more and more HP scaling characters over time and just how generic and strong Yelan is as a unit, I think this con is only going to get stronger and stronger. Many of us learned early on from units like Sucrose that EM sharing can be incredibly powerful, and given that technology likes to cause a lot of reactions and quick swap to a lot of teammates who are also doing the same, this just makes it a very strong constellation in a team based around him. The requirement is incredibly easy, literally just use his burst. Then you just gotta trigger some reactions with it, which it pretty much already wants to do, and it will refresh the duration, which will make the uptime pretty damn generous. It's a very strong EM sharing con with an easy trigger, and it's well implemented within the rest of his kit. Oh my, Cyno, his C4, it's so tragic. It is no secret that he is an energy glutton, and yet they gave him a C4 that gives energy, but it excludes himself. Now, arguably, it would have been bordering on predatory to give a character crippling energy requirements and then basically sell a solution to you at C4. Teammates will require a little bit less ER, but you will also have to build around this or have teammates that actually value it, because some might not, like Fischl, for example, who is a pretty potent electro battery all on her own and is a common teammate. This con really just feels like filler, and it's just kind of underwhelming. Now, unlike Cyno, this one actually does reduce the ER requirements of Nilou's burst, which is great because it's simultaneously also increasing the damage of it. Now, how important that is will entirely depend on the team you play her in and how you're building her. But overall, I would say this is just pure gain, and the best case scenario is going to be a pretty decent con, but admittedly, I just don't know how to judge it because, well, I don't have it and I just haven't gotten to use her that much yet. I'm basically saving her for when Nahida comes out, so they both feel new at the same time. I'm just not entirely sure what side it should be on, but I feel like either way it should probably be about in the middle. It feels like it's strong, just not too strong, you know? And that is all of them, and I would like to say that I went a lot easier on them than I would have liked to be honest. I think most of these C4s are total ripoffs for what they give, and yeah, there is totally 100% an argument to be made that all constellations are unnecessary ripoffs and you're just wasting your money. C3, 4, and 5 often just feel like obstacles to get to the far more interesting and obviously overpowered C6. Do you, the viewers, like that C4s often just suck? They're kind of boring, you know, not really that special? Or would you rather them be more interesting so that if you ever do go for a C6, you don't have to feel like you have to go through some crap to get to the prize? I think I've made my stance pretty damn clear. I hate almost every C4 we have, but what I don't hate is my patrons. I love them. They're the best. If you would like to become one, links to my socials are down below. Thank you for watching as always, and I will see you in the next one to, I don't know, fantasize about C6s that none of us are ever gonna get. I might someday.
Attaboy!